Today we're going to talk about rebirth, the history of the idea, over time, and some thoughts I have about that, coming right up. I'm Doug Smith. I'm director at the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you want to get a free mini course on wisdom, kindness, and calm, check out the link above, or just check out onlinedharma.org. And if you're interested, you can also check out other courses I have over there. So rebirth. Rebirth has been a central part of Buddhism, of Buddhist thought, of Buddhist philosophy for hundreds and hundreds of years, for thousands of years, really. It's a central part. And while many of us may consider it a rather obscure or odd kind of view, it is a view that fits, I think, most closely to a cyclical view of time. And time, especially when we think of long periods, but actually all of time really, is in a way most easily seen as cyclical in a sense. When we think of time as it's experienced, we experience time as going in cycles. We have the cycles of the year, where of course we have a cold period, a winter, followed by a warm period, and then a cold period again, in a cyclical kind of pattern, with similar kinds of times or between the cold and the hot. The same being true in of course in India, where you have the monsoon season, the rains, that occur in a similar time every year. We have also the period of the moon, the lunar cycles. We have the period of the stars in the sky. We have the periods of the planets going through the sky. Here I'm talking, of course, about a pre-modern idea of all this, a pre-modern idea of time. And then within ourselves, we also have a very repetitive kind of a cyclical notion of things occurring in the body, such as the breath, such as the heartbeat. These things that continue over and over in a similar kind of time scale, but just repeated with, of course, with slight variations all the time. Now, the earliest recorded writings or thoughts, they weren't originally writings, but thoughts from ancient India, and indeed some of the earliest in all of humanity, are the Vedas. And the Vedas, while they did not include a very, shall we say, philosophically sophisticated understanding of such things as the cycles of time, there was an idea that after our death, we might perhaps go to a better place, a heaven, if you like, and the heaven was understood in sort of vague terms as being somewhere in the sky, perhaps. And there was a metaphor in the Vedas that involves rain coming down from the sky. And scholars have suggested that might have been an early kind of idea of rebirth in the Vedas. Of course, it wasn't fully worked out, and maybe some people believed it and some didn't, and maybe it was the sort of thing that needed time for people to sort of figure out what it might mean. But nevertheless, the Vedas, being written or composed in a very allegorical or metaphorical style, can be interpreted in many different ways. But in any event, one possible interpretation here is that souls of the dead go up to the heavens, which is somewhere up in the sky, and then the souls are returned to earth in the form of rain, where they may indeed take rebirth in the form of other living things, perhaps plants, perhaps animals, perhaps humans again. It's not entirely clear. But here we have again a cycle of life, of basically water going up into the heavens, being evaporated up into the heavens, being precipitated again down as rain, and then beginning to grow again as plants, releasing water. This is perhaps a more modern reinterpretation, but nevertheless you get the idea. Now, it seems that Western culture is relatively unique in having a linear view of time, at least more modern Western culture, because it wasn't always this way. If we go back into ancient Greece, which is sort of the birthplace of much of Western philosophy, then we find a number of ancient Greek philosophers who had a similar kind of cyclical view of time, such as Pythagoras, and indeed even Socrates himself seems to have had a belief in rebirth, a belief in what's called in ancient Greek, or in Greek, metempsychosis, this idea that beings were reborn in different bodies after they died. This was an idea that was, again, in the air, and it's one that makes sense with a cyclical view of time. If you believe in all things being reborn, the seasons passing and returning again, then it might also be that just the way plants die in the winter and are reborn in the spring, perhaps, or I should say die in the fall and reborn in the spring, perhaps too human beings are, and living things are of all kinds. And indeed, the contemporary philosopher Julian Baggini, who's sort of a more popular philosopher, has written a recent article where he talks about how the West has a lot to learn. Western philosophy has a lot to learn from other philosophy in other parts of the world, different ways of viewing things. And Baggini says that cyclical time is, he says, the most intuitively plausible way of thinking about eternity. Indeed, most contemporary ideas of deep time, of cosmology, involve an idea of an eternal return, if you like, of a certain kind, of a cyclical time. That is to say that the universe, it's said, will probably end in a cold death because it's going to be expanding out forever. Eventually, the material in the universe will reach a sort of a state of complete non-existence, practically. All things will cease to exist in the universe. They'll decay into nothingness. And then this nothingness, or relative nothingness, will persist for a great deal of time. But within that nothingness, there's going to be seeds of the rebirth of new universes. At least this is one hypothesis. While there are other hypotheses, and to be perfectly fair, there's really basically no evidence for any of this. This is just speculation. Nevertheless, contemporary cosmologists at the cutting edge of contemporary cosmology are indeed holding to some models of an eternal return, of the idea of a cyclical kind of time. It's also fair to mention that Friedrich Nietzsche, the famous Western philosopher, did also have an idea of an eternal return, of a cyclical kind of time, although for him it was more that you would live the exact same life you'd always lived, but you would just live it an infinite number of times. This is sort of a hypothesis of his that he looked at in kind of horror, as sort of a Groundhog Day kind of thing. And this is, shall we say, a more ironic or sophisticated kind of view of the cyclical time that we have from the ancients. The cyclical time of the ancients wasn't an idea of this kind of you'll live the same life over and over again. Rather, it was that there would be a complete return of all things, not exactly in the same way that every summer is different from every previous one, but it has rebirth involved. The things are reborn, they live different lives that next summer, and then they die again in the fall. So basically, apart from this small issue of some ironic ideas or concerns of Nietzsche, basically in the West, cyclical time has never been important after the ancients in the West. And what changed? Well, things seem to have changed in the Near East around the time of the Roman Empire, indeed with the rise of Christianity. And at that point, what we had was a new idea of time based on an understanding of the world and of reality in which basically God was going to come down and change things irrevocably. That you were going to have a time on Earth where things developed as they do normally, and then you were going to have basically the end of the world. You were going to have a time of Armageddon. You were going to have a time of the sort of overturning of history as it had been to that time. You're going to have the intervention of God, the reign of God on earth, and basically you're going to have, of course, at that point, judgment. And then what happens after judgment is that certain people go to heaven, other people go to hell, and there is replaced a steady state where you are either in permanent glory or you are in permanent damnation. So the idea of the eternal return is then replaced with a linear view of time that leads up to judgment and then goes on linearly after that. So basically this is a judgment, I should say this is an ethics or an idea of justice in which the idea of karma that is, shall we say, goes up and down over an eternity is replaced with a finite period where you can act in the world, at which you are judged, and after which you're either good or not. And there's a lot that does not make sense in this linear view of time. From a point of view of justice, which is, after all, sort of the reason why this model was developed, this model is pretty clearly unjust. That is to say, no matter how much evil or wrong you do within a finite period of time, that does not merit an eternity of either damnation or glory. Or I should say, it doesn't merit damnation, and no matter how much good you do, it's hard to see how that justifies an eternity of glory. In both of these cases, the view, the temporal view, the cyclical view of justice that involves a temporal period of action being recompensed by a temporary period of either good or bad, that is, the view of karma and return, is a more just kind of model. Nevertheless, the Christian view, basically it's a Christian view that came up in the Near East, in the time of the Roman Empire in the West. That view has sort of dominated Western thinking for centuries and millennia thereafter. And that's sort of the way it remained until 19th century with Western colonialism, when Western colonialism met with Buddhism and other ideas from the East, which were more cyclical in their understanding of time. And there were a couple of different, I would say, strands of contact there that are important to keep in mind. They're of course run together, but they are in fact somewhat different. The first are the Christian missionaries who looked to convert Buddhists and other believers in rebirth in Asia and the East. And there also were shall we say, the scientists, or at least scientific ideas that were impacting on ideas within Buddhism as well. And these reactions or causes and conditions were somewhat different. The missionaries, of course, didn't believe in rebirth. They believed in this eternal judgment day, if you like. And so they wanted to convince believers in rebirth that rebirth was not an adequate kind of view. Now, the scientific understanding is rather that both of these views are somewhat problematic. Both of them seem to go somewhat beyond the evidence we have in front of us. Both the eternal view of damnation or glory, and the view of rebirth and karma, both seem to go beyond the evidence. Nevertheless, both of these strands from the West impacted upon Asia in general, impacted upon the parts of the world that have been colonized by the European powers. And so what happened partly, though, was that the Buddhists in Asia, many of them looked to science to be on their side. In other words, what they did was to counterweight the important power, political and otherwise, of the Christian missionaries within their purview, within their countries, was to use science as an ally. That is, many Buddhists within the purview of Western colonialism took on a rhetoric of Buddhism being a scientific religion. And there are certainly ways in which the Buddhist teachings are more in concert with the ideas of Western science than was Christianity. One example being deep time. Within Christianity, time was traditionally understood to be relatively limited. That is, the creation of the earth was only a few thousand years ago, at least traditionally understood. It wasn't that long ago. These ideas, of course, were in ferment at the time, in the late 19th century. There were people who were saying that that wasn't correct. And the Buddhists were saying, no, we have a very deep view of time, that time is not just a few thousand years ago. That time goes back millions of years, or, uncountable eons, if you like. Also, Buddhism clearly was very deeply interested in human psychology, and had a lot of very profound and deep things to say about psychology, in a way that you really could not find, certainly in biblical teachings, and not even really in Christian theology. And psychology was, in the West, a new branch of science, something that was interesting and new, and people were just discovering for the first time in a scientific way. And so that seemed to resonate with Buddhism. And then there was the clear empiricism of much of Buddhist teaching, of the idea that the way we come to know things is by looking, is by experiencing, is by seeing in our own life, rather than through, let's say, faith in some text, in some revealed text or origin. And so that as well seemed like a way in which Buddhism was more in line with a sort of a scientific understanding than was Christianity. But there was still the overarching idea of rebirth, because while in many respects Buddhism was quite compatible with a scientific understanding of reality, in other ways it was not. And one of those ways was this idea of rebirth. It was at least questionable from a scientific perspective. Similarly questionable as anything from Christianity, should we say. And so as a result, over time, there were a number, in particular in the 20th century now, a number of even traditional Buddhist teachers who either taught that the Buddha himself did not believe in rebirth, or taught that while the Buddha may have believed in rebirth, it was not at all central to his message. People like Ajahn Buddhadasa and Jnanavira Thera are two examples of those. And then we have other very influential thinkers, such as the politician B.R. Ambedkar, who was a wonderful politician who did a lot of real great ethical kind of teachings for the untouchables within India and the lower class people within India. He basically, in his book Buddha and his Dhamma, tried to, I would say, reinterpret early Buddhism in the light of scientific understanding of the world. And one of the things he did was to reinterpret rebirth as meaning simply that the atoms in your body would outlast your lifetime and continue on to new bodies. And in particular that mass energy, or energy, was conserved over time with all of the atoms and other physical objects in our body, that mass and energy were conserved over time, and that sort of implied a kind of eternal return or rebirth of the same kinds of mass and energy as these things went into new forms, as you like. And most recently, Stephen Batchelor, who comes from a deep understanding of traditional Buddhism from Tibetan perspective as well as a Zen perspective, having been both Tibetan monastic and a Zen monastic during a good part of his life, Stephen Batchelor has a very, I would say, sophisticated interpretive scheme that he takes to Buddhism in general, and early Buddhism in particular, where he basically says that we should only take seriously those aspects of the Buddha's teaching that were original to him, and not the ones that were culturally conditioned by his surroundings. So, for example, Stephen Batchelor basically says that rebirth was in the air at the time that the Buddha was around. It was part of the general understanding of reality at his time. And as a result, it was certainly not unique to him. It was certainly not something he developed himself. And so, as a result, it's something that we can perhaps leave to one side when interpreting the Buddha's message, in favor of putting weight on those parts of the Buddha's message that were original to him. Now, in response to this, I would only say that from a strictly scholarly perspective, there's no debate that the Buddha believed in rebirth. That is to say, if you look to scholars of early Buddhism, the people who study the early texts, there's really no debate at all that the Buddha did believe in rebirth. He states his belief in rebirth over and over again in the texts. It's not the sort of thing that can be excised from early Buddhism as though it were some later interpretation or later imposition on early Buddhism. Now, as to my own views in this, I'm not going to get into them in too much detail right here. I'll probably leave that for a future video. Nevertheless, I think what I would say is that I believe we can retain the heartwood of the Dhamma, of the Buddha's teaching, by focusing on a practice that merely is of this life. And that practice is really no different, not different in any important respect from a more traditional practice. Now, it may not involve a belief in future lives, but at least it's the same practice of ethics, the same practice of meditation, the same wisdom practices. And I did an earlier video of what the Buddha might have thought about this kind of secular approach, which I'll put a link to up here in case you're interested in how I think the Buddha might have reacted to this kind of development. If you're getting some benefit out of these videos of mine, please do check out my Patreon page. It's linked here down below. It also will give you some discounts on courses over at the Online Dharma Institute. Thanks so much for all of you being here. Thanks so much to my supporters on Patreon. I really would not be able to do all of this without you. So thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. Be well.